In the spring of 1864, a group of German-speaking nuns arrived on the windswept plains of central Kansas, carrying nothing but wooden crucifixes, dog-eared medical books, and a doctrine they claimed was stronger than blood. No one knew exactly where they had come from, only that they called themselves the Sisters of Divine Mercy, and that they had been dispatched by a bishop in St. Louis to establish a boarding school for orphaned girls of mixed indigenous heritage. These were children born of violence, disease, or forced relocation, daughters of two worlds, yet belonging fully to neither. The school they founded was named St. Eliza's. It stood some 20 miles outside of Abilene, on a barren plot of land donated by a railroad magnate hoping to launder his conscience after years of exploiting immigrant labor. The building was erected in strict Gothic fashion, arched windows, red brick walls shipped in from Missouri, and a half-ton bell cast in Munich that still rusts in the ruins today. The mission's stated purpose was clear: to civilize, baptize, and educate. Newspaper articles at the time praised it as a beacon of Christian charity on the edge of the savage frontier. The sisters quickly gained favor from local clergy, town officials, and settlers who saw in them a way to impose moral order on a land still raw with blood and uncertainty. Their promises to feed and school unwanted children struck a chord in a country eager to reconcile faith with expansion. For those who lived close enough to hear the bell each morning or night whispered a different story. Farmers claimed the bell rang not at dawn, but at midnight. Railway workers swore that smoke from the school's chimney never ceased, not even on Sundays. And one woman, now long buried, remembered a strange detail from her childhood: the sound of girls crying, always on the night of a new moon. When St. Eliza's welcomed its first class, mostly girls between 6 and 12, all of them part indigenous, it was widely seen as an act of mercy. But over the course of 8 years, 93 students were transferred according to the school's sparse records. Not a single one of them was ever seen again by family or community. There were no investigations, no announcements, no graves. The school closed in the winter of 1872 for lack of funding, and from that moment, the name St. Eliza's began quietly vanishing from diocesan records. If you're listening to this from anywhere in America, Kansas, Ohio, New York, the Dakotas, I want to hear from you. Do you believe an entire school full of children could vanish without a trace? Or do you think some people knew the truth and chose silence? Because in this story, the most terrifying thing isn't what happened to the children. It's how an entire community allowed it to happen over 8 long years without asking a single question. By the summer of 1865, the first class of St. Eliza's had settled into a strict and silent routine. 34 girls, most between the ages of 6 and 12, were divided into dormitories according to age, obedience, and blood. Though the school's public mission was to educate and uplift orphaned girls of mixed descent internal records, those that remain show a different hierarchy. Children with lighter skin tones were placed in higher learning groups given music and French lessons, while darker-skinned girls were rotated through chores, prayer drills, and obedience conditioning. The official curriculum focused on scripture hygiene and English literacy. But the true education at St. Eliza's had less to do with reading and more to do with forgetting one's language, one's name, one's family, and above all, one's tribe. New arrivals were stripped of their traditional clothing and assigned Christian names upon intake. Leah replaced Little Raven. Susanna replaced Halatzi. The older girls were forced to burn the belongings they had arrived with woven bracelets, cloth doll's beads made from river stones. One of the younger children reportedly cried for 3 days after her rabbit skin pouch was taken from her and thrown into the stove. By the 4th day, she stopped speaking altogether. The sisters called it cleansing. Parents, when they were still in the picture, were told that the school would offer their daughters the skills to survive in a white man's world. And in a sense, that was true. The girls learned to keep their heads down, to say thank you when they were punished, to smile when they were hungry, to scrub floors until their knuckles bled and call it discipline. They learned to write beautiful letters that the sisters dictated, which were then sent back to tribal communities and poor settler families as evidence of progress. I am so happy here, the letters read. Thank you for sending me. I pray every day and eat well. The handwriting was delicate, the grammar perfect. Many of those letters are still preserved in diocesan archives today, tucked between hymnals and mission reports. If you read closely, you'll find patterns, the same phrasing repeated across different children, the same verses, the same closing line. Tell Mama not to worry. I am in God's hands now. If you've ever wondered how a place can erase a child without leaving scars that the world wants to see, St. Eliza's may offer you an answer. But be warned, that answer requires something harder than belief. It requires confronting the kind of silence that can only be learned by children forced to survive it. If you're still with me, ask yourself this: how many letters would it take before you began to notice they all sounded the same? Would you notice at all? Or would you, like so many others, find comfort in the illusion that everything was going according to plan? Next, we'll follow the intake records of one girl, Sarah Lightfeather, whose name appears in 3 registers but in no departure log. Her disappearance would be the first to raise quiet questions that no one was willing to say aloud. Sarah Lightfeather arrived at St. Eliza's in late October 1866. She was 10 years old, the daughter of a Kiowa healer and a white soldier who had died in service 2 years prior. Her mother, unable to secure ration stamps from the Indian agent without proof of educational commitment, agreed to surrender Sarah into church care in exchange for 2 barrels of grain and a winter coat. A document preserved in the church's ledger describes Sarah as mild-tempered sleight of frame, semi-literate, with pleasing features and minimal resistance. Upon her arrival, she was renamed Clara. No one called her Sarah again. For the first few weeks, she followed the pattern of all new girls' silent obedience, wrote prayers, endless scrubbing. But unlike many, Sarah or Clara remained lucid. She watched. She remembered. She noticed things that other children, perhaps through trauma or resignation, had learned to overlook. She noticed that not all girls stayed for long. A tall girl named Miriam, who slept beside her in the dormitory, was taken from bed one night and never returned. The next morning, her cot was stripped clean, her belongings gone. When Clara asked where she had gone, a nun slapped her mouth so hard it bled. "God calls some home early" was the only answer she received. Weeks passed. Another girl vanished, then another. Each time, the name was crossed off the hallway roster. Each time, no one spoke of it. The sisters discouraged whispering. They claimed it fed demons. Clara began keeping count. She marked the missing with chalk smudges behind the latrine wall, thin lines stacked in cautious silence. She reached 7 by the end of winter. 7 girls who had been there one day, then gone the next with no ceremony, no goodbyes. Their names were not spoken again. In prayers, they were replaced by new arrivals. One night, in April, Clara was sent to Sister Agnes's quarters to scrub the floorboards. While cleaning beneath the armoire, she found a torn piece of cloth, bright red, hand-stitched with tiny blue beads in the style of Kiowa craft. She recognized it. It had belonged to Miriam. She tucked it into her boot when no one was looking and buried it beneath her mattress that night, whispering Miriam's name for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, Clara stopped eating. She wouldn't speak in class. During morning hymnals, she sat with her head down. The sisters called it a spiritual illness, but the truth was simpler. Clara had realized something that most children instinctively avoided: the school was not a sanctuary, it was a sieve. And some girls simply fell through. On May 3, 1867, Clara was recorded in the attendance log for morning prayers. The next day, her name was gone. There are no formal departure records, no letters to her mother, no burial registry. The only clue comes from a repair invoice dated the same week. Basement lock replaced old one damaged beyond repair. Scribbled in the margins was a single word, almost illegible, from water damage incident. Today, you'll still find Clara Lightfeather's intake form in the diocesan archives. A photograph is stapled to it, black and white blurred her eyes, cautious but alert. Below it is a stamped notation transferred May 1867. Transferred where no one ever answered that question. No one ever tried. By the summer of 1868, whispers had started to reach beyond the school's stone walls. Farmers' rail hands, even a few parishioners at the nearby mission chapel, had begun to ask quiet questions, always in private and never too loudly. Questions like, why were there fewer girls singing in the Sunday choir? Why did the wagons from St. Eliza's sometimes leave full and return empty late at night? Why did certain families stop receiving letters altogether, but silence when sanctified by uniforms and stained glass as a powerful shield? The church offered simple answers. The children had been adopted, moved to better schools, sent on missions to Christian families in the East. Progress, they called it. Mercy, opportunity, and who, among the townsfolk, many of them illiterate, indebted, or barely holding on to land, would dare question the word of God's servants? One woman did. Her name was Martha Fitch. She was the wife of a railway inspector and a mother of 3, all of whom had attended chapel alongside the St. Eliza's girls every Sunday. Her youngest, Anna, had formed a quiet friendship with a girl from the school named Ruthie, a bright, round-faced child who always wore a red ribbon in her hair. The two would share hymnals, whisper giggles during psalms, and exchange buttons like secret tokens. One day, Ruthie was gone. When Martha asked Sister Hildegard after service, she received the usual answer: Ruthie had been sent to a better home. But no details were offered, no address, no family name, just a dismissive smile and the insistence that she had been called to a higher purpose. 2 weeks later, Anna received a note under her pillow. It wasn't signed, and the handwriting was shaky, but she swore it was from Ruthie. The note simply read, "She said I had to go because I remember too much. I don't think I'm coming back. Please tell your mama to listen." Martha brought the letter to Father Dreyhouse at the parish. He glanced at it, folded it carefully, and told her it was a forgery, an innocent child's game. He thanked her for her concern, then asked if she would consider increasing her monthly tithe to help the mission expand. That was the end of her inquiry. But she kept the letter, folded it into her Bible between the Psalms and the Book of Lamentations. Decades later, after the school had closed and the land was reclaimed by prairie grass and ruin, her granddaughter found that same Bible in a cedar chest, the letter still tucked between verses of grief and repentance. The red ribbon came with it. Some say Martha tried to contact authorities. Some say she was warned not to. No report was ever filed. The basement beneath St. Eliza's was never listed on the school's original architectural plans. On paper, the building had 2 levels, a main floor for instruction and worship, and a second story where the dormitories lay under the constant gaze of crucifixes and oil lamps. But every carpenter who ever worked on the structure knew there was something dug deep beneath the altar room, sealed off by a narrow iron door with no visible keyhole reinforced with bolts from the inside. Sister Augusta called it a storage cellar. The girls called it the dark room. Few were ever sent down there, but those who were rarely spoke about it afterward. One girl claimed she was made to scrub floors until her fingers blistered raw. Another said she heard someone breathing through the stone walls. Most refused to speak of it at all. Their silence didn't come from fear, it came from something worse. They looked away when it was mentioned, as if acknowledging its existence made it stronger. In the fall of 1869, a thunderstorm tore part of the chapel roof clean off. Debris shattered several stained glass windows and sent water flooding through the altar chamber. During the cleanup, 2 stonemasons hired from Topeka were given access to the chapel's foundation. When they pried away a broken slab behind the altar's base, they discovered a narrow passage leading into the basement. The nuns had claimed the area was sealed for repairs. What the men found instead was a list. Just a list. Yellowed, creased, and half disintegrated from moisture. Written in precise, almost calligraphic handwriting. It contained names, ages, dates, and a single column labeled Disposition. Some entries were simple. Marion T., age 9, completed. Lillian R., age 11, reassigned. But others chilled the men to silence. Ruth Lightfeather, age 8, unfit, contained CL, illegible, age 10. Repeat incident. Restrained. The list ended abruptly at the bottom of the page with a final note: stockroom to be purged by Advent. Ledger transferred to Gertrude. The men brought the list to Sister Gertrude. The next day they were paid double their contracted fee, asked to leave early, and sworn to confidentiality under the guise of sacramental privacy. Within a week, both had left town. One was later found working in a lumber yard outside St. Joseph, Missouri. When asked years later about what he had seen in the basement, he simply replied, "Some doors aren't meant to be opened, especially in places that call themselves holy." No one ever officially confirmed what else the basement held, but starting that winter the sisters forbade the girls from entering the chapel alone. Prayer sessions were moved to the outer courtyard even in the freezing cold, and the iron door was boarded shut from the inside, sealed with nails and wax crosses. In 1942, a trunk was discovered during the renovation of a Jesuit seminary library in St. Louis. The label on its side read simply, G.V. St. Eliza's Mission, 1864-72. It had been sealed with brass clasps, then wrapped tightly in twine. Most archivists assumed it was a shipment of outdated hymnals or sacramental garments. What they found instead were letters, dozens of them. Each one was signed Sister Gertrude, 5th. The earliest was dated April 1865, barely a year after the founding of the school. The final one was dated just days before St. Eliza's closed in the winter of 1872. The letters were addressed to a single recipient, a man known only as Father M.H. Clerical Oversight, Baltimore Diocese. At first glance, the letters read like standard missionary reports, student counts, behavioral observations, requests for funding. But beneath the formal tone, something darker pulsed. Sister Gertrude wrote obsessively about obedience, about controlling impulses of the impure race, about a doctrine of separation that would eventually be adopted by others in the years to come. One passage stood out, dated July 1869. "We have found success with the fasting protocols. Physical compliance increases within 3 days of water restriction. The younger ones collapse quickly, but some of the half-breeds resist longer. These require reinforced methods. The cellar is effective for recalibration." In another, she wrote, "It is imperative that the archive ledgers remain with me. The bishop does not understand the value of containment models built from these children. Their memories are defective only because we insist they forget. Without forgetting, there is no salvation." She never refers to the girls by name, only by initials, measurements, or behavioral scores. One child is described as excellent at retention, weak in compliance. Another is labeled incorrigible. Awaiting reassessment, several are noted as unresponsive after music therapy, recommend transfer. Some letters include attached inventories, quantities of laudanum, raw opium carbolic acid restraints, and something labeled only as powdered lamb bone, blessed. These were not the supplies of a classroom, they were the tools of a quiet war. The most chilling note, folded between 2 pages and barely legible, read, "The bell rings for no one now. We ring it so they remember there is still a God watching." Researchers at the seminary hesitated to make the letters public. Some claimed they were forgeries. Others argued they were exaggerated, a product of religious zeal in frontier days. But when cross-referenced with diocesan shipping manifests, several details aligned deliveries of specific chemicals, repeat shipments of children's garments, even the names of 2 repairmen sent to fix a basement lock in 1867. Sister Gertrude was never punished. She lived until 1901 and died in a retirement home in Maine, where she was remembered fondly for her lifetime of service to the Lord's children. The final year of St. Eliza's did not end in fire or riot. It ended with footsteps small, bare, and desperate pressed into the soft earth of the Kansas prairie. In the spring of 1872, 2 girls disappeared not from records but from the school itself. Unlike the others before them, they were not quietly removed by night or marked as transferred. They ran. Their names were Mabel Crane and Elsie Greyhawk. Both were 11. Both had arrived 2 winters earlier, survivors of the Cheyenne removals and the measles epidemic that followed. They were close bonded by shared language, whispered lullabies, and the memory of songs that the sisters forbade. For weeks, they had been planning their escape, gathering scraps of bread, memorizing the guard routines, and watching the sky for signs of clear weather. One night after evening prayer, they slipped out through a loose slat in the dormitory wall. No one reported them missing until morning. The sisters claimed the children had wandered into the fields and become lost. A search party was dispatched, 2 farmhands and a priest with a lantern. They found nothing. But 3 days later, a shepherd boy discovered a bundle of cloth caught in a barbed fence nearly 6 miles from the school. Inside it were 2 items, a child's braid wrapped in muslin and a torn piece of parchment. The parchment held a message smeared with water, but still legible. It read, "Tell the others not to eat the white broth. It makes your sleep not end." We saw where they put Clara. We saw the hole. The note was quietly confiscated and never entered into any official record. That same week, strange things began to happen. Girls in the dormitory began wetting their beds. 2 stopped speaking entirely. One was found clawing at the chapel walls during morning hymnals, muttering the same words over and over. "She's under the wheat. She's under the wheat." She was sedated for spiritual affliction and moved to isolation. A month later, the wheat fields behind the chapel were burned accidentally, the sisters claimed, when a lamp fell during evening mass. But the fire began outside, not inside, and the flames traveled in a perfect circle around a section of unplowed earth near the stone wall. Several workers said they saw smoke rising before the fire ever touched the chapel. The burned patch was never replanted. 2 weeks after the fire, St. Eliza's announced it would be closing. Lack of funds, the bishop's letter said. Unsustainable operation. No mention of the missing girls. No mention of the note. No mention of the fire. Just one final line at the bottom of the announcement, written in careful script. "May the Lord shepherd those who have passed through our care." After St. Eliza's closed. In late 1872, the land sat vacant for nearly a decade. Wind overtook the chapel's stonework. Prairie grass crept through the cracks in the foundation. The bell tower collapsed during a lightning storm, and no effort was made to rebuild it. But what vanished fastest wasn't the structure, it was the memory. Within a year, the diocese had scrubbed nearly all mention of the school from public records. Parish rosters were revised, donation logs reprinted. Inquiries were redirected to an office in St. Louis that no longer accepted correspondence. By the time a new generation of settlers arrived, the name St. Eliza's had already been buried beneath layers of rewritten history. This erasure wasn't accidental. In 1881, a priest named Father Augustin Mueller, a young cleric assigned to the Kansas diocese, stumbled upon one of Sister Gertrude's reports in a mislabeled archive box. What he read disturbed him enough to initiate a private inquiry. His surviving letters, recovered decades later, detail conversations with former parish staff, local midwives, and even 2 of the old farmhands who had worked the wheat fields behind the chapel. In one letter dated November 1881, he wrote, "There is a pattern here. The school was not simply abandoned. It was made to disappear. The bishopric was complicit. The ledgers were doctored. The children, God help us, may have been sacrificed in ways I cannot bring myself to write plainly." 2 months later, Father Mueller was reassigned to a remote parish in Montana. His inquiry was never continued. The bishop who sent him there described him as overly emotional and spiritually unsettled. That same year, the Kansas State Education Board received an anonymous package. It contained fragments of a burnt ledger from St. Eliza's and a list of 17 girls labeled unaccounted. As of 1871. No return address, no explanation. The package was archived under Miss C. Correspondence not actionable. Over the next half-century, surviving students from St. Eliza's rarely spoke publicly. Those who did were dismissed as unstable or senile. Several suffered from what doctors then called conversion hysteria, loss of memory, unexplainable seizures, and long bouts of silence. The few that tried to file claims against the church were met with missing documents and quiet settlements. One woman, Eliza T., gave a deposition in 1919 but died mysteriously before trial. Her testimony was never released. The church offered no apologies, no acknowledgement, just silence and a continued insistence that the Sisters of Divine Mercy had fulfilled their calling before their disbandment in 1883. In 1943, a woman named Delilah James boarded a train bound for eastern Kansas. She was 78 years old, partially blind, and traveling alone. Her neighbors in Oklahoma thought she was visiting family. What she didn't tell them, what she had never told anyone, was that she was returning to the place where her childhood had ended. Delilah had been 10 years old when she arrived at St. Eliza's in the winter of 1875, part of a late intake group during the school's final months. She remembered the smell of the soap, the silence, the hymn that never changed. And she remembered the bell, how it rang even when there was no one to hear it. She was there when the fire tore through the wheat fields. She remembered the ash that fell like snow. She remembered Elsie. But what haunted her most wasn't what she saw, it was what she wasn't allowed to say. After the school closed, she was relocated to a Catholic shelter in Nebraska, then placed as a housemaid for a family that insisted she never mention where she came from. When she was 14, they burned her old school journal in front of her for blasphemy. By 18, she had stopped speaking about St. Eliza's altogether. Until now. That summer, Delilah visited the grounds of the former school, which by then had been overtaken by tall grass and wild pear trees. The chapel was gone. The foundation stones were cracked and half buried. But one thing remained: a single iron bell, rusted and tilted, partially sunk into the prairie soil. She sat beside it for nearly an hour. Then, with unsteady hands, she began to dig. No one knows what made her choose that particular spot. Some say she was guided by memory. Others believe she saw something in a dream. Whatever the reason, she unearthed a box oak rotted at the corners with a rusted latch. Inside were 3 objects: a red ribbon, a child's spoon carved with the initials RL, and a water-damaged page from a hymnal with a line underlined in trembling pencil. Though I walk through the valley of forgetting, thou art not silent. Delilah wrapped the items in her shawl and carried them to the nearest parish. The priest who received her was kind but skeptical. He offered to send the items to a local museum. She declined. Instead, she mailed them to a woman in Chicago, a school teacher who had written a newspaper column months earlier asking for stories about forgotten girls' schools in the American West. That teacher kept Delilah's letter. She later wrote in the margins truth buried in a child's box. The silence is not accidental. Delilah died a year later in her sleep. She left no children, no will, just one journal entry found by her neighbor which read, "They tried to take everything, our names, our songs, our stories, but the land remembers. And I was never the only one." In the decades that followed Delilah James's quiet journey back to the grounds of St. Eliza's, other fragments surfaced, some by chance, others by design. In 1967, a group of archaeology students from a nearby college conducted a soil study on what had once been chapel land. They found calcium anomalies, tightly packed soil pockets, and remnants of what one student described as unmarked pits, too symmetrical for natural formations. When they filed their findings with the county, the report was archived under non-priority heritage sites. It was never reviewed again. In 1984, a retired nun named Sister Eleanor, who had joined the Sisters of Divine Mercy in its final year, confessed on her deathbed to helping prepare the quiet girls for rest. She named no names, offered no details. Her congregation declined to comment, citing her age and confusion. Then, in 1991, a storm near Abilene uprooted a tree along the northern edge of what locals now call Ghost Wheat Field. Beneath its roots was a broken tile floor and a single iron child's cot. No official excavation followed. The land was declared historically sensitive and reburied within a week. Today, there is no official record of St. Eliza's in the Kansas Diocesan Archives. No student rosters. No death certificates, no grave markers, just land and silence. But listen closely and you'll find that silence isn't empty. It's crowded, full of stories, never told names, never spoken hymns, sung in languages now erased. You'll hear it in the mothers who were told their daughters were too wild for salvation, in the priests who said you must trust the Lord's will, in the generations who lived on that soil and were taught never to ask about the bell that rang in the middle of the night. The horror of St. Eliza's isn't only what happened to those girls. It's that it was made to vanish not just from maps or ledgers, but from memory. And yet memory persists. It lives in red ribbons hidden in drawers, in stories passed down in secret between grandmothers and daughters, in the bones beneath the wheat that still refuses to grow. So here's the question we're left with: how many Saint Elizas were there? How many children disappeared behind words like obedience and mercy? And how long will it take us to stop calling it mystery when it was murder by silence? If you've stayed with this story to the end, you're not just a listener. You're a witness. And witnesses have a duty to speak what others buried, to name what others erased, to remember what the land refused to forget. Because St. Eliza's didn't disappear. It was disappeared, and now we remember. In 2003, an unmarked envelope was delivered to the Historical Collections Wing of the Kansas State Archive. There was no return address, only a faded wax seal pressed into the flap, an impression of a lamb beneath a cross. Inside were 12 black and white photographs dated between 1868 and 1872, and a handwritten note that read, "Preserve these. Do not return to the church." The photographs were fragile, curled at the edges, and bore the fine cracks of gelatin silver prints long exposed to humidity. What they captured had never been published in any textbook or missionary brochure. In one, girls sat in straight rows in front of the chapel, their expressions vacant, their hands clasped as if instructed. A nun loomed at the edge of the frame, her face slightly blurred as if she had turned at the last second. In another, 5 girls stood barefoot in snow beside a cellar door, their heads shaved. A chalk mark, either a number or a cross, had been drawn on the door behind them. The photograph bore a timestamp, January 1870. A third photo was more disturbing. It depicted a long corridor dimly lit with iron rings affixed to the stone walls. A small shadow in the left corner suggested a child crouching, but the image was too faint to confirm. None of these photographs matched the public image the church had once offered of St. Eliza's. None appeared in diocesan reports or anniversary pamphlets. And when archivists attempted to trace the seal on the envelope, they found it matched no known modern institution. However, a religious historian noted that a similar seal was once used by the short-lived Ecclesia Mariae order, a sect disbanded in 1883 under quiet scandal involving excessive penitential practices. Within 6 months of the envelope's arrival, access to the archive's restricted collections was suspended. The photos were reclassified as sensitive, then quietly removed from the catalog index. Only digital scans remained circulating unofficially among researchers and historians who recognized their weight. One photograph, however, was never returned. It showed a group of girls gathered in a field, possibly during a staged lesson. A few smiled awkwardly, but one girl sitting slightly apart stared directly at the camera. Her face is solemn, unflinching. Around her neck is a ribbon red, frayed at the edges. Her initials stitched into the collar of her dress are just barely visible, DJ. This image was passed to a university lecturer in Chicago, an expert on memory and trauma who recognized the initials. It matched the name of a child recorded in a 1943 letter from Delilah James, the woman who returned to the ruins of St. Eliza's. The photo was taken in 1871. Delilah had survived. The revelation confirmed what many had suspected, that some of the girls had endured, even if the world tried to forget them. But it also raised questions about how many more remained unnamed, their faces lost to time, their stories buried beneath denial and doctrine. The silence around St. Eliza's was never passive. It was engineered. Each omission, each redacted report, each deflection disguised as pastoral concern, these were not accidents. They were strategies. And still traces remained. In photographs, in whispers, in a girl's unwavering gaze across 130 years of dust and forgetting. By 2010, the story of St. Eliza's had become a topic of quiet discussion in academic circles, but remained almost entirely absent from public history. There were no plaques, no memorials, no acknowledgement from the church or state. The prairie had swallowed the last visible remains of the chapel. The wheat fields returned. Developers showed interest in the land, but each project collapsed, some citing zoning complications, others unable to explain why machinery failed when digging near the old stone foundations. That same year, a graduate student at the University of Kansas named Clara began researching unmarked graves in abandoned Catholic institutions. Her interest was personal, Her great-grandmother had been a child in a diocesan-run orphanage, though no records of her early life remained. In the footnotes of an unpublished doctoral dissertation, Clara came across a passing reference to St. Eliza's. The line was brief: institution closed under unreconciled circumstances. 1872. C. James D. Correspondence, 1943. The name led her to a file preserved in a local historian's private archive. Within it were copies of Delilah James's letters, transcribed interviews, and a map sketched by hand outlining a cluster of hollow soil sites behind where the old wheat fields had stood. Clara applied for a limited excavation permit. She received no response for 3 months. When it finally came, it was not from the state but from the Diocese of Salina, advising her that any research on defunct religious sites would require church oversight, citing the sacred nature of all lands formerly under ecclesiastical authority. She proceeded anyway privately with ground-penetrating radar and 2 fellow students. What they found was not dramatic: no skeletal remains, no mass grave. But the radar revealed 15 subsurface anomalies, uniform, evenly spaced, and matching the approximate size of child coffins. The anomalies were aligned in 2 parallel rows beneath what would have been the edge of the chapel's rear garden. Clara submitted her findings to the university, but the report was flagged by legal counsel and withheld from publication. She was advised to pursue less contentious sites for her thesis. 6 months later, she withdrew from the program. Before leaving, she deposited copies of her radar scans and research notes into a sealed box labeled James Site for Future Inquiry. On the lid, she taped a simple message typed on archival paper: "Do not let the absence of bones excuse the absence of truth." Her box remains in storage unopened, catalogued but rarely noticed. The university makes no mention of St. Eliza's in any curriculum. The church remains silent. The land remains undisturbed. But history, real history, does not vanish. It waits, sometimes in boxes, sometimes in ribbons, sometimes in soil that refuses to stay silent, and in this case in the spaces where the names of 93 children should have been. In 2016, a routine audit of insurance claims from 20th-century Catholic institutions led to the discovery of a payment labeled only as Settlement, Archive Damage, 1979. The claim was filed under an obscure order name, Servants of Divine Silence. No such order officially existed, but a single redirection led investigators to a warehouse in Independence, Missouri, owned by a defunct religious printing company. Inside, a locked storage container rusted shut, sealed with wax and chain, contained hundreds of water-damaged books, handwritten ledgers, and correspondence between the Diocese of St. Louis and its remote Kansas affiliate between 1864 and 1873. Most of the records were indecipherable. Mold had eaten through ink. Pages fused together. But one document survived. It was a letter dated June 12, 1872, addressed to Bishop Matthias Romer. The author, Sister Gertrude, who had not been heard from after the school's closure. We have fulfilled the burden entrusted to us. The field is cleared. The daughters who could not be cleansed have been returned to him as instructed. The bell has been silenced. We await no absolution. No other document bore her signature again. This single page was verified by multiple archivists. Its handwriting matched earlier entries from the St. Eliza's inventory logs. The tone, the phrasing, the finality, it was not a report. It was a confession, one not meant for public eyes. Attempts to publicize the letter were quietly blocked. The diocese cited jurisdictional limitations and unauthorized access to private sacramental documents. A legal threat followed. The letter vanished from public hands shortly after. Yet, its contents had already been scanned and disseminated privately. For scholars who had long suspected that the school's purpose was darker than assimilation or education, this was confirmation. Not metaphor, not mismanagement, not forgotten reform, cleansed, silenced, returned. The phrasing echoed the euphemisms used across dozens of similar institutions in the 19th century, coded language that blurred ritual punishment and erasure. It mirrored the vocabulary used in colonial missions, in indigenous residential schools, in asylums for women labeled hysterical, in reformatories for wayward girls. St. Eliza's was never alone. It was part of a network, a method. The letter is now kept in encrypted form, shared only between vetted historians, protected as much from the church as from conspiracy theorists who twist truth into spectacle. But the scholars agree, on one point Sister Gertrude's final message was not repentance. It was closure. And it was written under the assumption that no one would ever read it again. She was wrong. In 2021, a former legal assistant for the Diocese of Salina leaked internal memoranda to a journalist under federal whistleblower protections. Among the documents was a scanned image of a burial permit dated September 3, 1872, issued for temporary interment pending formal rites. The name field was left blank. The cause of death unrecorded. The burial site listed was St. Eliza Southern Tract near Orchard Edge. This document, authenticated by state archivists, provided the first formal acknowledgement of a burial on school grounds. It also corroborated the location marked on Delilah James's 1943 sketch, the same place where anomalies were later discovered beneath the garden soil. Within weeks of the leak, the church issued a statement denying institutional wrongdoing, claiming the permit likely reflected standard procedure for that era and could not be tied conclusively to the school. Yet, privately internal communications showed concern. A bishop's aide wrote, "If one site is exposed, others may follow." This was not an isolated case. The language of containment of damage control mirrored the responses seen in Ireland, in Canada, in Massachusetts. Anywhere children disappeared under the care of religious institutions that promised salvation and delivered silence. The burial permit sparked renewed academic interest. A panel of historians requested access to diocesan records from the 1870s. Their request was denied. In response, they began building a shadow archive, one formed entirely from personal letters, legal records, whistleblower leaks, and the possessions of former students or their descendants. Among those possessions was a small tarnished pendant passed down through 4 generations of women. Inside, behind the cracked glass, was a curled fragment of paper, written in a child's hand, barely legible. "We were not bad. We were not nothing. Please say our names." No name signed it, no date, but the handwriting matched a surviving grammar workbook found in 1945 belonging to a student once registered as Agnes, age 9. Agnes never appeared in census records again. The pendant now rests in a private collection. It is not displayed. It is not for sale. It is preserved in the same velvet box where it was found alongside a single strand of red thread. For those who have studied the history of St. Eliza's, there's no longer any doubt about what occurred. The question now is not if children died, it is how many, and why no one stopped it. What remains is not just grief, but responsibility. To document, to preserve, to speak the names that others tried to erase, and to understand that the true horror of St. Eliza's was not confined to one field, one year, or one building, but embedded in every institution that believed obedience was holier than innocence. In the winter of 2023, a quiet vote took place at a local Kansas Historical Commission meeting. The proposal was simple: to install a modest plaque near the overgrown perimeter where St. Eliza's once stood. No names, no accusations, only an acknowledgement that a girls' school formerly operated here between 1868 and 1872. The motion failed. 3 votes to 2. One commissioner reportedly asked, "What's the point of memorializing something no one remembers?" The question was rhetorical, but it echoed the logic that allowed St. Eliza's to vanish in the first place. Still, memory does not rely on permission. Each time the ground shifts. Each time a child's object is found where no record said a child should be. Each time a red thread is pulled from the mouth of silence, St. Eliza's is remembered. It exists in unofficial archives maintained not by institutions, but by ordinary people, genealogists, local historians, educators who tell their students about what the books don't say. It lives in handwritten margins and in whispered family stories passed down from women who were taught never to speak. It lingers in wheat that never grows straight along a southern edge of prairie. The chapel is gone. The bell is rusted silent. The ledgers were destroyed or rewritten. But the school, the idea of the school remains, not as a building, but as a question. Who counts who is allowed to be remembered? And what does it say about a country that built sanctuaries where the most vulnerable were hidden, not to be healed, but to be made invisible? In the end, St. Eliza's was not destroyed by fire or storm. It was undone by exposure, by the girls who survived, by the women who returned, by the researchers who refused to look away. And though no marker stands at the site, no official apology offered, one thing is certain. The silence that once protected St. Eliza's is broken, not by vengeance, but by truth.